start talking about that. We'll pause here, and as is customary, we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll read and we'll discuss. So if you would pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. Father, we are grateful to you for the world that you have made. We say this over and over, Father, that we are thankful for all that you have done, but we cannot repeat it enough, God. We are thankful for the care and compassion that you have shown us, particularly in revealing yourself to us through your word and through the sending of your Son, to be a teacher and an example, but more importantly, Father, to us, a sacrifice on our behalf to redeem us. We are grateful for all of these things, Father, that you have done and do, and for all the things you will do for us in the future as well. We thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus, and we pray these things in his name. All right, so this is a great point to reiterate one of those things that I've said before, I will say now, and I'm sure I will say again, that the verse and chapter divisions within the Bible are largely arbitrary. In the book of Psalms, they are not quite so arbitrary, of course, because they are individual songs that are collected, so the chapter divisions within Psalms fall on the places where the songs divide from one another, though in not every case do the scholars always agree exactly on that, but for the most part. The verse divisions, though, are imposed as a way of finding your way through the text. Some of these books, as you're well aware, can be very long, and there can be a lot of information, and so having a good index reference system to find your way through with the chapter and verse divisions is exceedingly useful. But it can sometimes, without realizing, trap you into a way of thinking about this that places these here as if they were, in some sense, authoritative. That the proper way to understand a verse is the verse itself in that particular context, but there is nothing in the original that says this is where the verse runs. So 14, chapter 10, verse 14, is a good example of this. In the NIV, it reads, "And the fool multiplies words. No one knows what is coming. Who can tell him what will happen after him?" It may make more sense to take the very first part of that and put it with 12 and 13. "Words from a wise man's mouth are gracious, but a fool is consumed by his own lips. At the beginning his words are folly, at the end they are wicked madness, and the fool multiplies words." In some ways, it makes a lot of sense to break that thought there and then follow that up. "No one knows what is coming. Who can tell him what will happen after him?" And think of that as a separate or independent thought. That is a thought that has occurred earlier in Ecclesiastes, where the uncertainty of what is to come is given as an example of the meaninglessness of our actions here in this current life. But it could also make sense together, as apparently the original person who broke this verse and set these divisions thought, that the talking about things is foolishness in part because we do not know what is coming. My point here is kind of this larger point away from the actual content of the verse, that there's not a real hard and fast rule about how you should understand the way these ideas fit together. Right? In any lesson, in any sermon on any particular topic, people will take verses from different parts of the Bible and kind of build them together to make a point about a topic. But in some measure, that is always removing them from their original context. Right? A verse from Colossians was originally part of the idea of the letter that was written to the Colossians and is supposed to be contained within that, even if it is applicable to match it up with ideas from the Gospels and the Old Testament on a particular topic. So, long-winded way of saying, you don't have to be tied down to one particular way of understanding this, because there are multiple ways in which you can use this. We can talk about this in the context of Ecclesiastes. We can use the verse about the fool and the way that the way that they act and behave and think and speak in concert with verses in Proverbs, just about foolishness in general. So there's different ways that it can be used. So, having said that, I'm going to read here from 14, and then I'm going to read down through the end of chapter 10, and then we'll see where we go when we talk about the actual verses. And the fool multiplies words. Man does not know what shall be, and that which shall be after him, who can tell him? The labor of fools wearies every one of them, for he does not know how to go to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes eat in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes eat in due season, for strength and not for drunkenness. By slothfulness the roof sinks in, and through idleness of the hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes glad the life, and money answers all things. Revile not the king, no, not in your thought, and revile not the rich in your bedchamber. For a bird of the heavens shall carry the voice, and that which has wings shall tell the matter. So this continues the way this has been running for the last chapter or so, where we have wisdom given in these little proverb-sized nuggets, and it is less of a prose kind of argument than it is short little bits of wisdom that are given as a general matter. No one knows what is coming, and who can tell him what will happen after him? So this is at the second half, or the second two-thirds maybe, if you're doing it by word count, of verse 14. First of all, what does this mean? And then why is it here? It's sandwiched in between two statements about foolishness and fools. Yeah.
We kind of touched on that last week, ended on it. Just reiterating, one potential is that a foolish guy trying to sell a bill of goods knows that he's blowing hot air, so he keeps multiplying his words, trying to convince you of his fallacy. I think that happens a lot.
Sure.
That certainly makes sense.
Yeah, people often will try and fill the space by running at the mouth in order to keep you from being able to think too hard or clearly about any of it. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I mentioned this earlier. This is kind of a callback to earlier parts of Ecclesiastes, where the writer talks about no one knows what comes after you. This idea that you can live your life in some way or construct something that will last in posterity after you're gone, he says, is a meaningless and fruitless pursuit, because you cannot know that the person to whom you leave things, the person to whom you entrust what you have built, will not just tear it down after you're gone. I mean, we see this clearly all around us all the time. Right? Not only of physical objects does this happen with, but again, without wanting to delve too deeply into the current politics of the matter, right? Even your words can be changed after you're gone. Right? Legacy of Dr. Zoyce, Roald Dahl. There was an article this morning I just saw about Agatha Christie's books being changed, altering the way that she wrote them. Now that she's dead, she can't do anything about it. You know, this sort of thing can happen, and the idea that it won't is foolish. Yeah.
You see it all the time in the political realm. You see totally different interpretations of what were said at different times. I mean, no takers, you can look at the federal papers, different things, and see clearly what the intent was, what actually was said about different things. And there's mainstream media in different places trending things that are absolutely contrary to that, and yet it's being bought, it's being sold. People don't mind the sinker. It's very disgusting.
Yeah, it happens in every field of human endeavor, right? Politics is another one. You see it happen with education. You know, colleges, universities founded in a particular way to do a particular thing, stray from that mission. You can look at it in the field, in the area of religion as well. Right? Does anybody know what lives on the Temple Mount? What building is there right now in Jerusalem? It's a mosque. Yeah. The original site of the Jewish temple now has a mosque on it. Because at some point in the past, right, the Romans came through and they wrecked everything, and then the Arabic empires came through after the rise of Islam, and they took over Jerusalem, and they went ahead and built a mosque there on top of the hill, and that one is still there to this day. Right? The original idea of what should be there, the original designers, these people that built temples, these temples didn't last. Solomon's temple was destroyed, and the temples that came after it were destroyed too. Right? That there is no guarantee that the things we do will last. And in some way, this ties in nicely with the words about fools, because you're really kind of a fool if you think that the things that you build here and now in this temporal world, this temporary world, will endure and give meaning to your existence. And it kind of becomes obvious when you just sort of stop and consider how often that happens to other people. People that are wealthier than me, people that are more powerful than me, people that are a lot smarter than me. Well, what am I going to really leave as a legacy? This is not the place, he is saying, to find your meaning in life. He moves on in 15. A fool's work wearies him. He does not know the way to town. How does the one follow from the other? What is the relationship between these ideas? A fool's work wearies him. He doesn't know the way to town.
Kind of like the old saying where you're young and you find your way home.
Yeah, no, I think that gets right to it, yeah. The fool just wears himself out doing things because he doesn't know how to do even the most basic things. Yeah. It's you couldn't pour water out of a boot if the instructions were on the heel, right? Like, yeah. The fool wears himself out doing work that accomplishes nothing because he doesn't know how to do anything. He doesn't even know how to walk into town. Like, how hard is that? There's a road. You just stay on it. You'll get there. He doesn't know the way to get there. Yeah. Again, these are these proverbs that are like the book of Proverbs, where you have the same form. I've said this, and I'll say it again because it's worth saying every time we're talking about it. But you get the line and then the follow-up line that follows it, right? So just picking a proverb at random, 29:23. A man's pride brings him low, but a man of lowly spirit gains honor. The idea is to pair those two ideas together so that you gain the wisdom that comes from both statements. In the same way, a fool's work wearies him. He does not even know the way to town. Fools are simple enough. I don't want to hurry people on if we need to pause there, but I think these next verses are a lot of fun. So, yeah, no, please. Certainly.
Circles of our own busy work, where there's a greater destination that we should be going towards and working for, and kind of that is foolish to be so caught up in your own ways, because nothing that we do for ourselves is going to matter, and it all has to do with Him and the kingdom. And so kind of like that image of staying at home, like, this is my house, I'm building for myself and for my family, and like all my friends to be here with me, when the Lord's prepared a place for us to all be there together and focusing on that.
Well, that's an excellent point, yeah, that it is, the endeavor of building for yourself and imagining that it will endure is that foolish endeavor of, you say, walking in circles, right, going nowhere, accomplishing nothing. That's an excellent point. Yeah. I'm going to move on then. You've had your 5 seconds for you to come up with them. All right. Woe to you, O land, whose king, in the NIV it has, was a servant, and whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, whose king is of noble birth, and whose princes eat at a proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. My other translation has king as a child instead of a servant. It depends on how you translate that. So this has a larger structure, but still follows the second statement kind of format, but we double it up and make it larger. So the first one has a statement and then a second one to go along with it, and the next verse pairs two statements to contrast or to compare with them. So we have the king who is a servant or a child versus one of noble birth, and then princes that are feasting in the morning versus those eating at a proper time for the proper reason. What is the problem with having a child or a servant, which is, I think, the more interesting translation, as someone who is king?
Somebody with no experience on the throne listening to advisors who maybe fools themselves.
Okay? Well, certainly lack of experience is not good in a leader or someone who thinks that they're better than they are or something. Yeah. Yeah.
Also comes back to when you look at a child, you look at selfishness or I want, but not willing to do any work to achieve those things that you want everybody else to do. Comes down to a sense of entitlement.
Okay, yeah. Certainly a kind of a selfish desire for their own satisfaction is, it's a hallmark of children everywhere until they are taught better and more properly. Yeah.
I think this scripture speaks to being a citizen of a nation that is led by people that are inexperienced, immature, foolish, get up in the morning and feast. They don't have wisdom. On the other hand, if you're lucky enough to live in a nation where your leadership is wise and experienced and so forth, and has a common sense of, rule and way and pass laws and whatever that are sensible and based on good logic. And I think for me, that he's speaking to that. You're lucky if you live in a country like that.
Yeah, he's certainly saying that it's, right, one is far better than the other, right? Woe to you, O land, and then the foolishness, and then blessed, right? And that you hopefully are fortunate enough to live in a place with better leadership, a better king, a better ruler of whatever sort. When he talks about a noble birth, though, right, in 17, whose king is of noble birth, why does being born into the nobility make a difference such that it is contrasted with someone who is a servant? Yeah.
If you go back to Greek philosophers, the best leader is one that is not sought out that position, and actually train people to be leaders and set aside a certain class, and they're taught to be that, and they come about it in that manner, the same way that they would if they were born into a family of leaders. There's something about that they inherently have that leader
Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, it can be a question of competence, right? Someone who has been prepared for such a position or given the right information for such a role will do better than someone who is inexperienced and potentially thrust into it without preparation. I'm going to have to move my left to right here. Yes?
Like, with, when you look at, say, rural families and whatnot, it gets passed down from generation to generation.
Mm-hmm.
And they've kind of lost, from my point of view, they've lost sense of reality as the generations go by. And to me, it comes down to how a person was raised, whether they can be a king or a leader or whatnot. And if it's passed down through bloodline and generation, you lose the sense of connect where if you get somebody from the outside coming in
Mm-hmm.
that's had a different upbringing and been raised right and doesn't have that sense of entitlement where this is all mine, then things can run and be a lot smoother when and you want it's what I'm looking for. The king can be better fit for the people and to be a servant for the people if they're raised right.
Yeah, there's an interesting paralleling of ideas because we're used to the idea of servant leadership, right, which is exemplified in the gospel, right, that he who is to be the foremost should be the least, last should be first, and so forth, that Jesus shows through his model of leadership. And on the surface, at least, this appears to contrast with that, where the servant is deprecated as being a good leader, and someone who is born to this position is elevated. But as you're saying, a lot of it has to do with upbringing or training or things like that. Wayne, I wanted to move to you before you. I forgot that you raised your hand. Sorry about that.
I was going to say kind of what he said. I heard the word nobility. It didn't so much hit me as somebody that was well-educated and maybe was a little bit that way. The difference between nobility in my mind and not
Mm-hmm.
is one leads to serve me, being served, from birth, being served, versus not having that, and your way of life or your brain would lead towards servanthood. Just way harder to be a servant if you've never known anything but being served.
Yeah, there's this kind of association of ideas. I don't know how much of this is due to who we are, right, as modern Western people. The idea of someone being born into a position of power, this hereditary nobility or monarchy, ruling simply through right of birth, I mean, to be honest, as Americans, that runs against the grain, right? You know, it gets our hackles up a little bit as, who are you to tell me what to do? But what I think that he may be trying to point out here with this particular contrast is the difference between someone who is accustomed to responsibility and someone who is not. That if you have lived your life entirely without being responsible for making decisions for others, but of always being told what to do, there's the idea of, and it is somewhat antiquated, the idea of noblesse oblige, right? That with nobility and with authority and with power comes a resulting, what's the word, concomitant set of responsibilities as well. And this is one of my favorite places where this is talked about is actually in a C.S. Lewis book, part of the Chronicles of Narnia, in the Horse and His Boy, where there's someone who finds out, a character finds out that they are actually going to be, they're the lost son of a particular monarch, and they will have to be king later on in life. And his father tells him, he says, look, you might think that being a king is all money and parties and feasting. He says, but it's not, right? That there are those wonderful things that go along with it. He says, but if there's a war, you've got to be out there on the front line. You've got to be the first person up there charging, and you've got to be the last one coming back when you retreat. He says, if there's a famine, you have to be the happiest person over the smallest meal because you have to set this example for everybody else. You have an immense responsibility to care for everyone in your kingdom that goes along with having the authority and power to make decisions. And this is, I think, the idea that maybe the author is going for here with these two contrasts. That someone who has lived their life not having to be responsible for others, or even hardly themselves in many ways, right? That many of the servants of this time and place were little more than slaves in a lot of ways. That they are not accustomed to making choices without thought for themselves, or making decisions that will benefit others. Not that that's impossible, and not that having the mindset of a servant is bad, but this idea of balancing responsibilities is better when someone who has practiced and thought about it and been raised to it is given that role. And this is something that we all, of course, can participate in. I mean, this is what Jesus gives us as a model when he gives us how we should behave within the church, right? That we should all, when we are given positions of any sort of power or authority or leadership, think of ourselves not as a way of using that to gain honor or material gain or anything like that, but how can we use that power and authority and responsibility to benefit everyone else, right? That the good king, the one that rules well, is the one that has that idea of nobility, not in the sense of inherent worth because of your birth, but in the sense of possessing virtue to rule for the benefit of their people. Yeah.
I have a slightly different take.
Please,
on this.
please.
My version says child.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read this, I kind of was reading it from that perspective.
Sure.
And all of us who have children know they're not only selfish, but they also have no concept of future. Like all their decisions are very short-lived.
Mm-hmm.
Even teenagers and young adults have a hard time seeing what the choices they make now and the impact they have later, or the lack of doing things now for later. So when it talks about feasting in the morning, if you're going to feast and drink in the morning, you're doing nothing all day, right? You're wasting your whole day not being prosperous and not planning and not doing all the things you should do. So in a sense, you do become a sloth in that you're not taking care of things that need to be taken care of. You're not fixing things that need to get fixed, or helping your kingdom be what it can be because you're busy pleasuring yourself now for the immediate. And then also you kind of talked about too that a little bit about nobility doesn't necessarily just mean you're born of a noble birth, but it's character too. You can be someone who has no nobility of your line of inheritance, but you could be a very noble character person. So I think that someone who's noble is going to think about the people who depend on them first rather than themselves. So I kind of read that more of a child's perspective and how a child would handle responsibility versus maybe a servant.
No, I think it's 100% correct, which is why I think that the alternate translations exist and why they work both so well. Yeah, exactly, that a child, as anyone who has had children know, children come into this world extremely selfish creatures with no thought for anyone but themselves and their own needs, right? That's what babies do, right? They're hungry, what do? They scream at you until you feed them, right? If they're unhappy in any way, they just scream at you until you try and fix it somehow. And as they slowly grow older and as they are taught better and they learn and mature, this sort of thought of others can be introduced in the thought of the future. Yeah, exactly, that they don't think ahead. I mean, the number of times when my children, my boys specifically, have told me that it's like, all right, I want an RC car. I'm going to save my money, and I'm going to go and I'm going to buy a really nice RC car with my money. I'm going to save it up. And then 2 days later, it's like, ooh, can I buy that candy bar? I thought you were saving your money. It's like, but I want the candy bar now. They just don't have that thought for the future until you train that into them and help them gain that experience of planning ahead and thinking about other things besides what's right in front of me right this minute. Yeah. The nobility, I don't want to belabor these points too much, but The reason that we in English use that same word as an adjective for the positive virtues that people have, right? Saying someone has a noble character, and as a noun referring to someone who has been born into a position of aristocracy, is because originally that was the ideal concept, is that those born into a position of aristocracy were expected to have those virtues. Now, they didn't always. Sometimes they lacked them in an extreme degree. But it was understood that the ideal noble person born to power and authority should have virtues like courage, selflessness, generosity, mercy, right? That these were supposed to go along with that position in society. The expectation of them was that. And it slowly changes over time. I mean, people don't have them, then people start to say that you should assume they have them just because of who I am and where I was born and things like that. But the original concept partakes of that idea that those people need those virtues in order to be the proper person in society that they are supposed to be. And in the same way that we, whether in our own lives, as parents, in the workplace, here in the church, if we are to be good leaders, we have to possess those same sorts of virtues, the virtues that Christ emulates for us in the Gospels, and be willing to serve others as part of our leadership. There's just no way around that. Good leaders have always been people that serve the interests of those that they lead. From the beginning of the Bible down to the current day, forever into the future. All right, that was a long monologue. Sorry about that. Other thoughts about this here? It was an excellent point, too, that you made about the way that they give the examples about feasting in the morning versus eating at the proper time, doing things without regard to consequences versus trying to focus on doing things appropriately and improperly to strengthen themselves rather than waste it away in dissipation. Yeah, please.
I think the principle that gets involved here doesn't just apply to nobility, but it does apply, it works with nobility because it also applies to common man. An example of that is, if you've had a family that had a history of great-grandpas, grandpas, so on and so forth, all served in the military, in wars and so forth, it becomes a family cultural thing to go into the military and the kid that's come up in a family like that has been raised in a way that's one of the subjects that is in the background. It's there, and they're taught to think a certain way about duty and honor and so forth. And so that progression continues. And I think that the same kind of thing can happen in kings and so forth, where that past history then is fallen back on and taught to the child and is brought up in that matter. And, it's kind of my perception, and I don't pretend to know all that much about Queen Elizabeth, except it's my perception that she was brought up in that manner, taught those high standards. And for the most part, the things that I've read about her, she tried to live her life in that way and tried to do the right thing in so many places and took responsibility for things. And I think that's what the expectation is with the nobility, and I think that's where he was trying to go with what he was saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It does fall apart. It does fall apart because people are people. Some people just don't.
Well, this is an excellent segue into the next verse in 18, where he draws a similar sort of conclusion, moving from positions of high power and authority, rulers of the land, down to the very particular individual, right? If a man is lazy, the rafters in his house sag. If his hands are idle, the house leaks. Right? That if you go even to the micro level, one individual person who doesn't behave in a proper manner, right? That if you are lazy and unindustrious, you neglect even maintenance and doing the routine tasks of everyday life, you will suffer. Things will fall apart. Right? That if you don't keep up with the little things, even if you are a person of small consequence in terms of the wider world, politics, etc., things will still go badly in their own little ways. I don't know that it's, again, these are the more proverb type elements of wisdom. They're general ideas that are supposed to be used to extrapolate a principle. And I think that you can do that for everything in between as well, right? It's not just the individual in his own house. It's not just the king ruling the whole land. You know, it's your manager at work who's got a team of 12 people. It's the mayor of a town. It's anyone in a position of some authority and responsibility. If it's not done well and exercised properly, things fall apart. Things fall apart. Entropy gets us all in the end. Second law of thermodynamics. All right, I've used up my time here, but I will, if anybody has a final thought, a connection to draw, something that came up in a previous verse that we really need to say, that's fine. This is your moment. Please do. Yes, sir.
So, especially like Queen Elizabeth, when she was young, was not raised to be queen. She was an offshoot. Her uncle was going to be king. Her dad was never going to be king, so there's no concern about that. But then watching her father thrust in the limelight, and then herself being thrust in there, having to suddenly take upon this duty, greatly influenced her life. But we've seen that with other great English leaders. Henry VIII gets a bad rap for his marital statuses and his religious beliefs. But he was also thrust into being king. He was not supposed to be. It was his brother. And look what he did outside of what we all know. The hospitals he built, the schools that he developed, the work he did for the government and their navy and army. He was such a great king, but once again, you have somebody who was not supposed to be there, so that's not how he was raised.
Sure, no, that's an interesting point, that this is the sort of thing that anyone raised well could be prepared for, right? This is more about character in some sense. Yeah, then.
It ties a lot to, nobility. He wasn't raised to be there, but you can taught it as long as your mindset is in the right place.
Sure. Anyone else? All right, then we will stop here. We will hopefully finish chapter 10 next week. Thank you all very much.